We reached the end of Colson Whitehead's zombie novel Zone 1 this week. I want to kind of rethink the levels of resolution that are in this novel's conclusion. Do you read this novel as an old story or as a description of some new chaos? What vision does Whitehead give us of the end in this novel? One level of the end, of course, is the end of the city. When the wall, the barricade that holds the zombies at bay comes down, the city is overrun again. The city that they've cleared, supposedly. So this is a great description of it on 275, that the wall is the thing that separates the order of the city from the chaos of the zombies outside. Whitehead writes on page 275, when the wall fell, it fell quickly, as if it had been waiting for this moment, as if it had been created for the very instant of its failure. Barricades collapsed with haste, once exposed for the riddled and rotten things they had always been. Beneath that facade of stability, they were as ethereal as the society that created them. This kind of end is imagined as an end of order, an end of the, quote, reconstruction, unquote, that is posed by the provisional government at Buffalo, right? And throughout the novel, you follow that sense of developing order that Buffalo has pretended to have. That order that is kind of typified by the song that is at times sung and at times whistled. That song, "Stop, Can You Hear the Eagle Roar?" And that the mythical order that's posed in that song is set against the chaos that is always being held at bay throughout the novel. That chaos, whereas Whitehead writes on 48, where juice boxes were still the legal tender in some parts of the country. So that fight between order and chaos, and does the resumption of an imagined chaos, does that signify an end in some ways? That order that's there is always a coming reborn world that the characters here crawl towards, as Whitehead describes it on page 29. But it's a temporary sense of order, an imagined sense of order that's always there, and Mark Spitz always has a full sense of that. That, as he notes on page 239, Wonton was off kilter. Perhaps it was a higher than normal flood of skells at the wall, but Mark knew the refuge had done what all refuges do eventually. It failed. So Mark Spitz, with a strong sense of realism, right, realizes that the wall, is only a temporary stay. And the order that supposedly Buffalo is imposing is only an imagined order. The chaos is kind of the norm here. This comes into strong relief in the lieutenant's suicide on pages 250 and following, where he places a grenade into his mouth, legendarily, and kills himself. And at that point, right, Mark comes face to face with the fact that this order is, whatever pretended order was there is now gone. And on page 318, the end returns, right? The entire population was snared in bygone moments, entranced by the world that no longer existed. An imagined sense of order there, right? But it was happening again, the end of the world. And the ways in which we imagine the chaos that is being held at bay when it returns, that is some end in some sort, is that how is that an imagined end, and what power does that imagined end have, versus the imagined order of reconstruction, or whatever word it goes for it. There's also a sense of end in the apocalyptic that we've discussed earlier with this novel, and that sense of is there sanctuary from the apocalypse? Is there a sanctuary from the end of the world? And Mark and his father, Mark recalls when he and his father are going to see these movies about, in the midst of the Cold War, these movies that are about a nuclear apocalypse, and the survivors of that event, and where do they go, and what size lives do they lead. And Mark asks his father, "What does apocalypse mean, Daddy?" And his father responds, "It means that in the future things will be even worse than they are now." As they sit in the theater and watch these kind of grim depictions of human life after a nuclear war. What comes out of that sense of looking for sanctuary, is it a world that is defined ultimately by displacement in the end, right? That it's defined by disorder and defined by movement and defined by flight. That a sense of entrenchment, a sense of home, a sense of digging in is only an illusion in some ways, right? That the nomad's world or the refugee's world is the really defining space of human experience. That we are defined by dislocation, that we are defined by displacement in the end. And Mark's story here is particularly pointed in his time with Mim. As they find a wintered space where they can, kind of hide out and live out the winter. Mim starts with the idea, right, that order is possible, right? That she says that we're going to beat this thing, and then we're all going to go home, right? That there is a conclusion to this apocalyptic event, and that home is eventually the space that they all are headed towards. But Mark, in his flight, begins to develop maybe a more realistic sense of that space as he continues to flee and sees the sanctuaries that those temporary sanctuaries that he finds come apart. He starts to believe by the time you hear about a place, it's gone. And even Mim, as the winter comes to a close and they start to think about how are they going to survive this kind of next spring and summer of zombie awakening, Mim will tell him, "You have to keep on moving, honey. You stay in one spot, you're just another straggler." And so being on the run, being defined by displacement is kind of the human condition. And Mark eventually in the city starts to realize that the city is going to come apart eventually, that it will no longer offer a sanctuary in the end. That he notes that there's no other reality apart from this. You move on to the next human settlement until you find the final one, and that's where you die. And so Mark himself is defined by that flight, is defined by that displacement, and how does that kind of represent the human condition in Whitehead's novel. Mark's story itself, if you imagine him as the hero of this novel, how is he defined by the conflicts that are inherent in this apocalyptic end? What sense of hope does he take in the midst of his flight here? As Whitehead notes on page 245, the business of the plague is to reveal those close to us as the creatures they had always been. But a part of him thrived on the end of the world. He had a knack for apocalypse. I've always been like this, he thought. Now I'm more me. So the conflicts here, that sense of survival that arises with his engagement of this end, becomes the defining aspect of his character. And if you think about the emptinesses that are present here, the sense of isolation, a sense of displacement that defines the ends of Whitehead's novel, do you read it as kind of an individual moral journey in which Mark comes to define himself against, the violences of the world? Or do you read this as, Mark's life as one more life that's kind of a part of a human aggregate of displacement, dislocation, of violence? Mark himself has this kind of realistic moment where he realizes how the violence of this world is defining him, where he stops hooking up with other survivors once he realizes the first thing he did was calculate whether or not he could outrun them. And so he finds that cuts into his human connection with that world. And the resolution of that realization in the end of the novel is, right, fuck it, you have to learn to swim sometime. So he realizes he's always going to be on the run. Is that kind of the moral of the story, the moral of the end of this tale? Against that, though, you have the sense of, is there a possible resolution in community? The lieutenant notes at one point, as Mark listens, you tell yourself you're still the person you were before the plague, even though you're running for your dear life through the parking lot of some shitty mall. And Mark connects to the lieutenant's vision. And whether the lieutenant believes this or not, right, that there is some humanity that's there that defines the characters in this novel, and in the end, is there a resolution to the community that shared humanity brings? As Whitehead notes on 321 in Mark's vision, the world wasn't ending, it had ended, and now they were in the new place. And how is that new place also an end, as Whitehead defines it here? Thanks.